Hello, and welcome to week 8 of Introduction to Psychology. Today we're going to be studying cognition, thinking, and language using symbolic communication. Excellent. Okay, so cognition means thinking and using knowledge. Cognition begins with attending to something, with attention, something that captures our attention, and then how we categorize that information, okay? Researchers learn about cognitive processes they cannot observe by measuring speed and the accuracy of responses. So cognitive psychologists are interested in studying the processes of the brain, how information is categorized into schemas, and how our memory is combined to form knowledge, okay? And then that knowledge can then be applied to interpret the stimuli, to perceive the social world, for example. So a very cool chapter. I'm excited about it. So attention. Some stimuli grab our attention more than others, okay? We notice something all right away and bam, we just see it, okay? This is called a bottom-up process because it's out of our control. We hear a huge sound or hear a loud sound out in the way and we're just like, what's that? What's that bang? You know, and just whatever we're doing, we stop because we heard a bang. That's the idea of a bottom-up process, okay? The book uses the example of a magician pulling a rabbit out of a hat, or even a dove, and then while it jumps away, that's when the magician, because everyone's focused on the rabbit or the dove, sets up his next trick, okay? And so the book had a really good discussion about the magic tricks. I thought that was a lot of fun, okay? We can also shift our attention deliberately by shifting it from one thing to another, okay? So like if you want to attune to something and search for something, it's what you do. You start going through all the different possibilities, looking through it, looking through it, and looking through it to find what it is we're looking for, okay? And that's the example of this figure that you guys see right here. Okay, so when you look at the picture, the very first thing you see is that there's a bird that's white, and you're like, well, why is there a bird that's white there, okay? So that's the idea of a bottom-up process. You automatically see the bird that's white, but then if you guys look at the next slide, here's a bunch of other birds, okay? Now you have to go find something that's looking to the right. So which bird is looking to the right? To do this, you have to do a top-down process where you search through the entire scene until you finally find the bird that you guys are looking for, okay? All right, so again, a lot of evidence suggests that our attention is limited, okay? Not only can we have conflict with our attention, but we can also have interference with our attention, for example, also, okay? So the Stroop effect is a really fun example of interference, for example. So the Stroop effect in the book, it talks all about this, but again, you're supposed to, say what color the letters are, and then they start putting in words, and you have to say what color the words are. And then they start putting in words like green and red, but then putting those words in different colors like blue and yellow. And you have to say which color is that word. And, people tend to read the word instead of saying the color that's correct. So if you have the word green written in blue ink, people tend to make an error and say green instead of it actually being blue when they're asked to tell the color, because that's the interference between the color part of your brain and the word part of your brain also working at the same time, okay? And then the book also talks about change blindness, which is a really fun example of that. There's a bunch of studies they used to do where they would go up and ask someone about directions, and they would say, hey, can you help me find this place, right? So I'd walk up to someone and say, can you help me find this? And while they're telling me directions and looking at a map or something, people would walk right between us with like a giant window or a big block or something so that it kind of blocks their view for a second. And then they would switch out the people, and the person giving the directions would continue to tell the person directions, not even realizing that they switched out people. And that happens about 50% of the time. That's an error that gets made, okay? So that's just examples of limitations and, potential errors with our attention that we can make, okay? So people vary in their ability to maintain attention, okay? So not all of us can just focus on something all the time, and then when we get in the unconscious and the conscious, we start talking about like who's really driving. Like imagine when you're driving a car, how much attention were you actually paying to while driving? Where you just kind of, was your unconscious driving for you, okay? But one of the disorders related to attention, such as autism or attention deficit disorder, they talked about ADD in your book, and this is characterized by an attention issue due to distraction, impulsiveness, moodiness, failure to follow through on plans. And then they also have the ADHD where they have the hyperactivity. And this is just also more excessive activity and fidgetiness, which, I kind of feel this way whenever I have to do a recorded lecture. It's a lot more fun to do it in front of people, but when I have to do it here, I get really fidgety and it's hard for me to focus. That's how I feel a little bit. This is a very real thing that people go through, There's a lot of issues with the diagnosis of ADHD. Again, from a sociological perspective, you could argue that children are often over-medicated. We're expecting children to sit still for 8 hours a day and go to education systems that they might not buy into. So are we over-medicating? But then there's also the psychological perspective that actually this is a disorder and there are issues with attention. So with all things, we should always ask a whole lot of questions, ADHD and ADD. This is one of the major things that I like to ask, from several points of view, from a medical point of view, a psychological point of view, sociological point of view, and really diagnose, is this an excellent diagnosis? Is this something we should be diagnosing kids with? Is it just because they're bored? So there's a lot of questions to ask when it comes to disorders, of course, and especially with ADHD, okay? The book does talk about a couple examples of this. So they try to say that someone with ADD is maybe slightly different than someone isn't when presented with a choice delay task, okay? So if I say, here's a small reward now, or maybe you can get a bigger reward later, generally, right, you'd assume, what's the bigger reward? Should I wait out? Whereas someone with ADD or ADHD tends to go ahead and choose the small reward. Then there's also the stop signal test that the book talks about. And this is when, you tell somebody to press a button every time you see a light. But then if you hear a noise, then you should not press the button. And, when you compare people's responses of not pressing the button when they hear the sound, for example, people with ADHD tend to make an error on that task more often than someone that doesn't have the diagnosis. So that's one thing the book talks about with that. So when it comes to categorizing information into schemas, okay, this idea of putting things into categories, the goal of this is to make our thinking more efficient, because if we have efficient organization of all of our files of memories that consolidate all of our information, it makes using that information far more efficient, okay? So many concepts are hard to define. You can probably recognize, some categories you have very strict words for, what is the color red, and you could even define that with reference to wavelengths, red is a 700 nanometer wavelength. But then if I said describe something like country music, what words would you use? It's a little bit more ambiguous. So again, the way we categorize things can be complex, but we can also categorize things in these kind of little bit more not so defined, as a general concept. And this is kind of the idea of a prototype, okay? This is familiar or typical example of a category, something that we base a lot of our information on, okay? All right, so conceptual networks and priming, okay? So we link a word or a concept to related concepts. The process by which the activation of one concept activates or primes related concepts is called spreading activation, okay? For example, if you hear the word flower, you are primed to think of a rose, violet, or other flowers. If you also hear red, the combination of flower and red then makes you think of rose. So flower will give you a general idea. But then if I said flower with red, then how many flowers do you know that are red? And again, this is the idea of how our categorization starts out with something general like flower, but then as we go down the tree of flower, there's all these different types of flowers, different colors of flowers, different smells. They all grow in different environments, for example, okay? And so the category for flower is very grand. It's an expansive category, okay? Okay, so there's two types of thinking and problem solving. Okay, so this is the way we attach problems, okay? So system one thinking is your automatic. Like I ask you a question and you just give me the first thing off the top of your mind, okay? But a lot of times you make an error, and the book has a bunch of examples of that. Definitely read through that. It's interesting. System two thinking is this idea of, instead of just going with your fullest impulse, your first thought, you start thinking about things all the way through, looking at stuff from all these multi-dynamic angles, right? So if it's something that doesn't really matter to you, you just, who cares, whatever, you just go with your initial thoughts, you roll with it. But if it's something incredibly important, like making sure you lock the door, because if you don't lock the door, then you'll get written up at work the next day, for example. That's the idea of system two thinking, okay? And so the way our brain approaches these problems, these to think about the reality and make sense of things based upon our categorical knowledge, we apply algorithms and heuristics, okay? So algorithm is just like it sounds. It's just a calculation. It's just like a math problem, right? For testing out hypothesis. And heuristics are strategies for simplifying problems. How do you take something really complicated and look at it in a much more easy to think about method, okay? So, maximizing and satisficing. These are the ways in which we apply strategies to think about every single choice, right? So maximizing is, again, what I was just saying of, you think through the problem from every possible angle to make sure you have the best thought, the best solution to your problem. And satisficing is, you just go through the list until you find what you're looking for, and then you're good, and then you move on, okay? There are many errors that come from human cognition, again, as a result of system one thinking, or just an incorrect answer with system two thinking, like we just made too quick of a decision, or we thought about it a whole bunch, but we still came up with the wrong answer. The book talks about a bunch of stuff. Overconfidence, like you just think you're right. Confirmation bias, when you accept a hypothesis, like someone tells you the earth is flat, and then instead of trying to disprove the earth is flat, you then go and search around and find out that it's actually round. Functional fixedness, the tendency to adhere to a single approach or a single way of using an item. Like once you've learned that method, that's what you always do. The framing effect, when you can answer a question differently when it is framed differently. So like if I present a question one way and then I ask it a different way and I end up with two different answers. And then the sunk cost, okay? That's the idea of, you've been putting so much money into it, you made a bunch of errors, but you're just going to continue making them anyhow, okay? Expertise is interesting that your book talks about. This talks about how eventually through pattern recognition over time, you can become an expert. And it talks about, you can do this at recognizing patterns of muscle movements, of things like that, just by playing the violin, for example. The book talks about the basketball player, and that a pro basketball player they can tell whether a ball is going into the hoop the second it comes off their fingers, whereas an average person, it might take, the extra couple milliseconds to really kind of see the angle of the ball. So that's really interesting. It also talks about how you become an expert, and it kind of gets into learning a little bit with near transfer. Near transfer, again, is, learning. It's like if I play guitar and then I start playing violin, because they're both stringed instruments, the more I play the violin, the better I am at guitar. And far transfer is like, does my violin playing make it so I can do math better, for example? Is there an association like that? Okay. And then finally, we have language. Again, and language develops over time. It does talk about the different ways that we can use sentences to make sense of things, okay? So non-human precursors to language. Again, language is an evolutionary adaptation as our cerebral cortex that enables higher level function evolved over time. You see some form of languages, but none as complex as it is with humans, for example, which makes that us uniquely human, right? That outer part of our brain, that cerebral cortex, those four frontal lobes, okay? So it is possible to have intelligence without language. Like language, just because you can't use language doesn't mean you're intelligent regarding this from a species perspective. But the language is a unique human evolution, okay? It's a unique evolutionary adaptation that other animals have, just not as specialized, as expertise as humans are when it comes to language, okay? The book talks about Noam Chomsky. If you get a chance to read Noam Chomsky, please do. And he talks about language acquisition device, and this is the idea that our babies, children, are born with a mechanism for acquiring language. Like, so the structures in the brain are built in, but without interaction from other people, then those areas of the brain don't develop, okay? The book also talks about the areas of the brain that are involved with, language and different processing. So it talks about the Wernicke's and some of the Broca's area damage and how that's related. But again, just because you have parts of the brain that might specialize, all you have to do is think about something and you can have an emotional reaction, for example. So our language, our thoughts is connected to every single part of our brain. Even though it might be specialized, like the actual heart of language processes in certain areas, for example, okay? The book talks about how it develops over time. And so that's really interesting how language, it takes a long time. But again, it's because you have to use your memory to build schematic knowledge of language and how to use the language and how to interpret the words and then how to become more formal. And then you have to learn the rules of the words and the context and how to use context to make sense, for example. So that's really interesting. The book talks about deaf children. All children try to use language, even ones who can't speak from birth, okay? And so over time, if you're deaf, for example, you might stop using sounds, but then, we still will use sign language, for example, to use our own language, some form. So even a deaf child in the wild, for example, might use sign language to be able to communicate in some form or another, okay? So that's really interesting. Understanding language, again, we use context a lot, guys. Not everything is like a clear-cut sentence. I can kind of pick up on what you're saying just by what you're kind of talking about to really make sense of what you're saying, even if you really aren't even making that much sense, okay? So again, language is not just sentence structure, it's also context, and it's learned information, and it's, interpreting what you think somebody's saying. It's a huge process, okay? It breaks it down into phonemes and morphemes. That's how words and word structure. Phonemes being the sounds and morphemes being the units of meanings, the combinations of sounds. And again, our brain is much quicker at recognizing morphemes than it is at looking at phonemes, for example. You can pick out a word faster than you can pick out a letter. Very interesting of the stuff the book is talking about there. Word recognition, again, that's the idea that, word superiority effect is this idea that when you see a word, you can recognize the word faster than you can just seeing a letter. And then they did that on a recall test. What word did you see? What letter did you see? And the book talks about how they can remember the words easier than they can remember the letters, okay? And while you're reading, the book also talks about eye movements. Again, you don't just sit there and read, and then you shift. You read, you shift, you look around, you look forward down the sentence, you look backward down the sentence, and by looking forwards and then backwards and then forwards again, that's how you actually make better sense of a sentence, okay? So catch yourself when you're reading. You read about 11 letters and then you look off. 11 letters and then you look off, and that's how we read. It's really interesting, okay? So again, such an honor. If there's anything I can do for you, please just email me and have a wonderful week.